Good afternoon. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founding director of the Skyscraper Museum, and I'm speaking to you from the gallery of our interrupted exhibition, Supertall 2020, in order to talk about sizing up supertalls. This is a subject that we've been thinking about at the museum for quite a while, but especially in preparation for the exhibition that is yet to open to the public, but can be seen online in graphics and images like the one that you see here. Supertall 2020 looks at a category which we call 380 meters or taller. And it's one of the topics that I want to address in this talk, because the idea of a rarefied group of skyscrapers and a category that includes in our exhibition some 56 towers rather than the more than 200 towers that the CTBUH calls supertalls, is a kind of question that I think needs examination, and examination historically. What our exhibition is not about, and this talk is not about, is the sequence of the world's tallest buildings. This is a graphic that's one of the oldest ones at the Skyscraper Museum, now more than 20 years since its founding, put together in the late 20th century, and then of course revised as necessary. And it shows us what we want to do, and I want to do in this talk in particular, is trying to think historically about this problem, but to begin in the 20th century and to contrast the development of global supertalls in the 21st century. So for our exhibition Supertall, we featured and focused on the more recent towers, and you see some of them here. They were also the subject of a lecture series that we ran this spring, Worldview, Designing Global Supertalls, where we invited the architects, engineers, and construction experts to talk in depth, in the long form, about their buildings. And of these 8 that we featured in the 13 lecture series, 5 of them are finalists in the best building for the 400 meter and plus category. So these towers which are the finalists, and I want to acknowledge and congratulate these finalists, and to pay a little bit of attention to taking them as our sample of sizing up supertalls during this talk. So the questions I'm going to ask you see here, and I'll progress to the slides and take a historical view in order to try to frame some of the questions that we're going to ask relative to the 21st century. So if we look at the cover of this book from 1930, let me begin with a kind of framing of the issue. Historically, in the design and construction of skyscrapers, there have been 2 major concepts and formulas of height: engineering height and economic height. While you can't have a modern skyscraper without a structural engineer, it's also the case that the engineer enables height but doesn't determine it. Nearly every skyscraper ever built, including the Burj Khalifa, could have been taller than it is. That is, it could have achieved an engineering height that exceeded what was built. Projects we think of as advancing the limits of technology are also bound by formulas of finance. In short, the ROI, or return on investment. In 1930, the authors Clark and Kingston published the study, The Skyscraper, a study of its economic height, and demonstrated in tables and diagrams that the most profitable height for a building may not be the one that has the most stories. Rather, as the book defined it, the true economic height of a structure is the height which will secure the maximum ultimate return on the total investment. The drawing you see here and related tables and calculations in the book showed that for this hypothetical lot in Midtown Manhattan, a 63-story building would return the highest percent of profit. Now, this diagram bears a very strong relationship to the Empire State Building, which has the same size lot, 200 by 400 feet. So why does the Empire State have 86 stories plus the mooring mast, which is the equivalent of 102 stories? That has something to do with the unquantifiable allure of the title of tallest building. While the concept of ROI will come as no surprise to the developers in the audience, it's a fact that the media and the general public don't want to hear. The press loves stories about the race into the sky, and their attention fuels that competition. None other than Adrian Smith, the architect of the Burj Khalifa and the Jeddah Tower, 1 kilometer if that is completed as planned, has explained in lectures, including one a few weeks ago for the museum, that announcements of the plans for the next world's tallest building attract such immense media attention that the PR itself is a factor that plays into the determination of a project's height. PR has real value. Yet the lasting annual value of great height lies in the number of floors that produce revenue. As you see in the first design of the Empire State, before the mooring mast was conceived, it was the floor plans that determined the form. And it was this sheet of calculations by the building's investors, typed in August 1929, before the architects were hired, that determined the tower would be an 80-story building. Now we have a conundrum. Does economic height apply to Supertalls? Projects that would seem to be principally about engineering advances and PR generating ambition? Do Supertalls follow standard formulas of ROI, or are they a special category that contradicts the skyscraper's fundamental identity as commercial real estate projects? I'm going to leave this image that compares a whole range of Supertalls, and as you can see, adds their floor plan as well as their gross floor area, their GFA, and I'll let you linger and in your eyes explore while I continue here. Supertalls are expensive. Extra height increases costs. Elevated costs, for example, for more and stronger materials, wind tunnel testing, dampers to counter sway, extra shafts for elevators, and in some countries, refuge floors. But extra stories also increase revenue, and observation decks can be extraordinarily profitable. In brief, Supertalls cost more to build, but they pay back that investment in a variety of ways. So let's think some more about Supertalls and whether they constitute a special species of skyscraper. First, how do we define Supertall? The chart that you've seen before, the world's tallest buildings, tends to treat an evolution of buildings rising ever higher. But the subject of Supertalls for our exhibition sees them as a category, not as an evolution. There are 56 buildings in the category that begins with a base minimum height of the Empire State Building. And you can see them here in the gallery as they're meant to be seen, but can't be seen on a computer in a long chronological stretch. All of the buildings seen by their date, so that there is not the progression of buildings becoming ever taller, but rather the exploration of a typology. So how do we define super tall? That depends on who you ask. The CTBUH, we know, takes 300 meters as the base. The museum takes 380, using the Empire State Building as the standard. Why 300 meters? That's unclear, other than the power of zeros. We like zeros. We like centuries and decades, the 70s, the 90s. But that framing, that historical framing, is merely a convenience, and we need to analyze within that what is meaningful. In 1889, when Gustav Eiffel completed his 300-meter tower, the iron structure exceeded by a factor of 2 the then world's tallest man-made structure, the all-masonry Washington Monument. In 1900 and even in 1930, 300 meters was super tall. It's not today. The indispensable CTBUH database tallies 214 buildings that stretch some part of their architecture to 300 meters and above. About 1/4 of these, 56, just squeak into the category by touching 300 or 300 to 310 meters. This large number does suggest that the goal of measuring up to the super tall category matters to some developers. It seems to me, though, that 200 plus buildings is just too many for a super category. So let's raise the bar. At the Skyscraper Museum, we think a building is a better benchmark than a number, and there's a benefit to thinking historically. So we use the height of the Empire State Building, as you see in this slide, 380 or 1,250 feet as our minimum height for a super tall. The 1931 Empire State was the world's tallest building until the World Trade Center in the 1970s, and it was the obvious benchmark for the Twin Towers to beat. By this measure, there were only 8 other super talls in the 20th century. With this higher bar of 380 meters, the museum counted 56 qualifying towers. So we capped our study in 2019. For our exhibition, we made the same scale silhouettes of the towers and lined them up chronologically. We also added a floor plate, which we consider key. Here's the group as they're supposed to be viewed in the gallery as in a mural. So if there is a value to super tall, and there surely is, since the word is invoked frequently in the media, then it seems smart to make the category more rarefied. Setting the bar at 380 meters reduces the number of super talls from more than 200 to 56. Further, using the nice round number 400, we can narrow the category to 37 buildings. So what's the best benchmark? Take your pick. In any case, we have in these 2 conference sessions, 7 finalists in the 400 meter and above category that afford the opportunity to sample outstanding examples of super talls in this more elite group. These towers range from 443 to 530 meters and from 87 floors to 109 floors. 5, though, have 95 to 98 levels. And examining just this smaller sample, then, can we see characteristics that are more meaningful than just vertical height? I have some ideas to offer, but spoiler alert, my main conclusion is going to be that we should be asking the experts, the developers and architects and engineers who design the towers. It's tempting to define and differentiate super talls principally by their structural systems. This diagram, which was first developed by Fazlur Khan and colleagues at SOM in the 1970s and refined by Bill Baker and others at the firm, looks like an evolutionary chart, and to some extent it is. But it is more properly a typology, or as Baker prefers to explain it, a classification of species of structural systems. Our 7 finalist towers represent a range of structural systems, even though most of them do fall in the core and outrigger category on the chart, as would be predicted by their heights. But let me set aside these various structural approaches, especially to the perimeter wall, and to focus on the core in order to make a much more general observation about the features they share, a concrete core, which is a nearly universal characteristic of global super talls. While skyscrapers of concrete became important in the 1960s, the core and outrigger approach of the 20th century super tall had its first key examples in the 1990s with the Petronas Towers and especially Jin Mao that you see here. The concrete core leads the construction process. It's simple and quick to build with jump form molds that reproduce the same regular unit floor upon floor efficiently and economically. I could show you dozens of examples, but here's a photograph of the core of Chengdu, Greenland under construction. In a clever arrangement where the rising core even supports the cranes. A drawing of the same tower makes clear the significant dimensions of the robust core versus the shallow lease span. You can see a range of floor plans and cores of towers featured in our Super Tall 2020 exhibition here and on our website. So it's not my intention to explain structural systems, which is certainly not my strong suit, but rather to make some obvious observations and I think underappreciated facts about the ubiquity of concrete in the 21st century. As I start to run out of time, let me revert to the smart and concise formulation Bill Baker has offered that summarize the differences between 20th century and 21st century supertalls. So Baker notes, if skyscrapers construction had stopped in 1975, one would say that the tallest skyscrapers are made of steel in the United States and are office buildings. Today, one would say that they are composite or all concrete in Asia or the Middle East and likely to be residential. And I would add an update, likely to be mixed use. I'll be even more emphatic and reductive. For supertalls, the 20th century is the century of steel. The 21st is the century of concrete. This pair of images of the World Trade Center and Jeddah Tower under construction exaggerates the contrast and makes clear the difference. Now let's quickly cover the next big topic, use. Mixed use towers that combine complementary programs for office, residential, and hotels have become a standard development formula for supertalls because stacking functions can produce taller towers with more spectacular views for inhabitants and impressive skyline defining silhouettes. We think of this formula beginning with the Jinmao in China and certainly carried on into the present and around the world. Of the 7 finalists, 3 of our buildings are wholly office buildings and 4 are mixed use. The proportion of office buildings in this group is unusual. A query of the CTBUH database shows the group of 37 towers of 400 plus meters. Of those, 12 are office buildings, while more than half, 22, are mixed use. Still, whether it's nearly half or just a third of the whole group, I'm surprised to see the significant number of office buildings that occupy 90 or 100-story skyscrapers. That's really a challenging amount of space to fill, certainly with a single company or in a competitive rental market. Indeed, many of these towers have been slow to fill up, which has become a common cultural and social critique in the media. See-through buildings, dark towers, zombie urbanism. So in closing, we return to the questions at the beginning of the talk. What drives height in supertalls? As engineers invent new ways to build higher, how do clients and their architects decide where to stop? Does an industry formula for economic height apply to the super tall-est, or are they a special species in more ways than structure? I don't think we have the answer to these questions yet, but I do know whom to ask: developers and their architects and engineers. In the Skyscraper Museum's recent Worldview lecture series, we started the process of inquiry by inviting 13 speakers, architects, engineers, and construction experts, including those who led the teams for 5 of these 7 session finalists, to speak about their supertalls in depth. It's their explanations and insights that have led me to pose these questions today. We need to ask better questions, not of the database of the Skyscraper Center, but of the experts who commission, design, and construct supertalls. We need to listen, analyze, and discuss. So let me end with another comment that I keep making at CTBUH conferences, and that I will continue to repeat until it gets some traction. Tall is not big. We need to pay attention to the other dimensions of skyscrapers, in particular area. And you see the New York buildings mostly in the 21st century that have been added to the skyline and make New York the premier city with the leading number of supertalls of any city in the world, even as at the end of the 20th century, it had only 3, and after 2001, it had only 1. Vertical feet is a convenient marker, but it's an inadequate measure to size up supertalls. So I hope that we can look at buildings in their multiple dimensions, that we can think of supertalls as something special and as a category where we can be both analytical and statistical and also reflect on the importance of sizing up Supertalls. Thank you very much.